Alright, in the last lecture, we were talking about the stages of an edit, and we started on talking about not raster. We're going to be talking about raster. We were talking about the review and organize section, and one of the things you had to know was formats and were you in a interlaced progressive mode. Another thing we need to talk about is raster size and aspect ratio. Now, raster size is the pattern of uniformly spaced horizontal scan lines that cover the display space of the device. Within each line or picture elements that can be illuminated individually. Essentially, you're talking about resolution with raster size. You're talking about how many pixels per image you're going to be having. If you look down here on the bottom, this is a very low raster size, very small. We have lots and lots of each of these color spaces create that image. We have slightly larger. This is increasing resolution as well. More resolution, finally full resolution. Now, they're all the same size. If you were to take this number one image and shrink it down into a postage stamp size, it may look like the woman. More so with this one, if you shrink that one down or shrink that one down. But raster size is all about resolution. So this image we could shrink down and it'll look as good here as it does, as small as it does at least at this size. Now if it would get blown up more, again it may look more pixelated, but certainly better than the rest of these. So raster size is about how many pixels you have. I don't want to say per inch because we're not talking about inch, but how many pixels you use uniformly to display an image. All right. In other words, raster size is also called pixel dimension. That is the number of pixels wide by the number of pixels tall. The resolution is determined by the number of pixels tall. The higher the number, the higher the resolution. So as I said, raster is all about resolution. Resolution. And it's measured in the number of pixels wide by the number of pixels tall. But it is the tall number, the second number, that really lets us know what the real resolution is. The higher that second number is, the higher the resolution. Excuse me. Yeah, several different raster sizes. You have 720 by 480. Then you also have that was the old standard def days. HD is 1920 by 1080. That second number is obviously much larger than that 480. Hope this isn't confusing you, or too much junk on the screen. But that second number is what we look at when we're determining that raster size. We're determining what resolution the image is. So if you're ever wondering, ooh, is this a video higher resolution than that higher resolution? Look at that second number if they offer it. If it says 1920 by 1080, you go, ooh, okay, that's higher resolution. There's also 1080 by 720. That's another considered HD resolution, but 1920 by 1080 is going to be higher resolution than 1080 by 720 because that second number is lower. So you always want to look at that second number. When classifying the resolution of a video clip, the second number, as I said, is the second number in the raster size is what is used. These are also called the scan lines. Going back to when we were talking about interlaced video. Number of scan lines, although it could be progressive as well, it's just those horizontal lines of pixels going across. Standard definition video is 720 pixels wide by 480 pixels tall, while high definition HD video is 1920 pixels wide by 1080 pixels tall. And then you get into things like 4K, which is even higher. You got 6K and so on. 1920 by 1080 is considered a higher definition resolution. If you look at these examples down here at the side, now these are not to scale by any stretch of imagination, but if you imagine these being pixels creating an image, this has if you could only create an image by coloring in those dots, this is going to make a much more rudimentary image than this. And this one over here, if all you can do to create an image is put different colored dots in each of those spaces, you can make a much more detailed, almost fully resolution image in that, even more so than this one. You could create in this middle one something quasi resembling an image that you would recognize, but no one would argue that this is even more so. So you need to take a look at the vertical resolution. Now you could ask, well, why don't they do the horizontal? It's just that vertical is what has been picked over the years for what they measure it off of. So again, looking at these examples, this means there are 1080 horizontal scan lines in a HD image. Please note that while standard definition video is 720 pixels wide by 480 pixels tall, this is an older technology. You'll run into this sometimes. Standard definition footage actually has 525 scan lines, but you can only see 480 of them. There are multiple reasons for this. Excuse me. There are multiple reasons for this. Older televisions weren't always made the same, and so some televisions showed a bit more of the vertical or less the vertical. And also the reason why is they had that 525 was that they would sometimes embed other information in those lines of resolution that were outside the viewing area, like closed captioning and those sorts of things. So keep in mind, standard definition video is 720 by 480, but there were 525 scan lines to it. And this can come in handy when you're not handy, but important if you ever get old standard definition footage when you're editing as an editor, because modern digital editors will include everything in the frame, and so your aspect ratio will be off just that much more. But you could probably get away with cropping it in a little bit and not worrying about losing a little bit of that top and bottom on the image. All right, aspect ratio. This is another thing that you need to take into consideration. Standard definition video. Give you an idea how resolutions have changed over the year as well. Standard definition video was literally this in terms of raster, and this was the shape. It was, we'll talk about this in a minute, but that was what's called 4:3. And then 1080 high definition images grew up to this size, and this is what's called 16:9. We'll talk about that in a second. And then you have the more cinematic, this is called 4K, and by the way, they are now up to 6K and even 8K cameras, and I'm sure it will go up and up and up. And when you start getting into these 4K zones, aspect ratio really can become very fluid, and you can change it to a certain extent to make things look more cinematic. When you're talking aspect ratios, though, you're not talking about resolution. So if you're looking at a standard definition or a high definition or a 4K image on a 19-inch monitor, you are getting the exact same aspect ratio and resolution as you would on a 42-inch monitor. The size doesn't matter in terms of giving you an image. It's still the same resolution. It's just a different size monitor. Excuse me. But when you're talking raster size can also determine aspect ratio. Aspect ratio is the ratio of width to height of the video. This is connected to raster because you are really seeing how many pixels wide is your image by how many pixels tall. So it's different though. Aspect ratio is a different thing to take into consideration than resolution. But you need to understand how aspect ratio works because it's that window that you're showing the world this image through. There are tons of aspect ratios, and I'm going to include a link to a video that you don't necessarily need to watch, but I would recommend on the history of aspect ratio. Um, it really goes through how it started, where it came from, and we're all over the map. But this is a sheet. I'm not going to dwell on this because you'll be able to take a look at this in the notes. Um, but there are, excuse me, dozens of different aspect ratios, and it's just basically how wide to how tall is what aspect ratio is about. But why do you need to worry about aspect ratio? It's because there are so many. You may, as an editor, be given footage that's in different aspect ratios, and you're going to have to make a decision on how you're going to work with it. Standard definition video, as I mentioned before, was 4:3. So if you take a look at this image from The Dark Knight, it was shot in what's called 2.35 to 1, which is CinemaScope, or a form of CinemaScope. And it's a very wide image. If this is going to go on a standard definition television screen and you didn't want to letterbox it, if you ever see a movie that has those black bars on the top and the bottom of the screen, it's because they're trying to show you the original aspect ratio of the image. But there has been times, or you may as an editor make this choice, that you don't want to have the letterbox, you don't want to have those black bars. And if you're dealing in a 4:3 environment, you're going to have to figure out where you're going to crop out that image. Or, again, you're dealing with widescreen footage and you need to take it into a 16:9 environment, which is most HD television sets. You again will have to make the choice, am I going to letterbox or am I going to crop this image to fit my television screen completely? And there's no right or wrong answer to this. It just depends on what you're trying to achieve with your project, what you want to use it. If it's important for your audience to be able to see the movie the way it was originally shot, then you'll letterbox it. If it's not important and you'd rather have consistency between all your images, then cropping would be your option. So it really depends on what you're doing, but these are things you need to be thinking about again while you're organizing and reviewing your footage and thinking about where you're going with it. The two most common aspect ratios you will have to deal with as an editor are 4:3 and 16:9, because those were the most common. 4:3 will be common because there are 50, 60, 75 years plus of 4:3 footage that you will have to deal with. And then 16:9 because that's what's going on most TVs out there. So those are the ones that you'll be most common, but you'll run into other ones. It is obvious at this point that the larger the number of vertical lines or pixel rows, the more detailed the image. However, within the arena of analog video, the number of vertical lines or pixel rows is fixed within the system. And the main two standard definition systems are called NTSC and PAL. Okay, so we're shifting gears here a little bit in that we've been talking a lot about we talked in the previous one frame rates and raster size, and now we're going through into aspect ratio and format, interlaced, all that sort of fun stuff. But again, when you're getting standard definition footage, this is still the case today, but it's not as difficult as it used to be. There used to be two different formats, as I was saying here, NTSC and PAL. There actually were about 5 or 6 across the world, but the two biggies were NTSC and PAL. And by formats, I mean that in that country they broadcast a specific format. And if you didn't have it, if you were in a country that broadcast in PAL and you had an NTSC TV set, you wouldn't be able to watch their programming. Or if you're in the United States with an NTSC television and someone was trying to brought you a PAL VHS from Europe, you wouldn't be able to play it on your VCR. NTSC is based on the 525 scan lines or pixel rows, 60 fields, which makes up, again, we talked about fields before. You have 2 fields for every frame, so 60 fields at 30 frames per second at a 60 hertz system for transmission and display of video image. And this is NTSC is the dominant in the United States. It was also in Japan and most of South America except for Brazil. PAL is the dominant format, was really the dominant format for most of the rest of the world. Analog television's broadcasting and analog video is based on 625 scan lines or pixel rows, 50 fields, or rather 25 frames per second in a 50 hertz system. Now, you could argue, lots of people argue back and forth about which is the better format. Really, they're both more or less the same. PAL was used by filmmakers a lot because preferred by filmmakers a lot because the 25 frame per second, because there's only 1 frame off the 24 frames per second the motion picture films were made in. And so a lot of filmmakers feel that PAL system made their movies look better on television because they would have to be converted for those extra 5 frames or 6 frames. They only had 1 frame to deal with. But you will run into this, though, as an editor. If you're dealing with older footage, you're going to need to know what country it came from because your edit system usually can handle them, but you'll have to set things up in your edit system to know where they're going to go or where they came from. So because if you have to mix different formats and aspect ratios all in the same timeline in your edit system, these are things you need to prepare for and think about how are they going to look when they're all mixed together. Looking at NTSC when comparing HD TV to analog NTSC and PAL standards, the fundamental common foundation of both systems is still the frame rate. So even though the United States and Europe are both working in digital HD, so that the difference between PAL and NTSC is a little not as absolute anymore. The biggest difference is still frame rate. HD frame rates from PAL-based countries is still at 25 frames per second, while HD frame rates in NTSC-based countries is still 30 frames per second. So they look the same more or less. But if you're in Europe, if your footage is going to be going to Europe, you're going to need to make a European version of it. Outside, if you're going to be broadcasting in Europe. While if you're going to be broadcasting in the United States, you're going to need 30 frames per second. Broadcast in Europe or formerly PAL countries, you're going to need broadcast at 25 frames per second. These are broadcast television formats. However, video also lives in many other places in a digital form, so it doesn't matter as much. Usually when the video data is recorded, some of it is lost. But that's going to be for another